Hi guys, welcome to the Milesburger channel, and in this video, you're going to be surprised, but it's been almost a year since I posted the Story of Atonement series, where I kind of go into detail about the career of, my backyard wrestling journey or whatnot, and I figured it's been almost a year, and we're coming up on the 10 years of CWA, and I figured, you know what? Why not do a little bonus episode? This one's going to be a little more fun, and I am going to also talk about some of my controversies. And some of the controversies and some other stuff that I forgot to mention, I did bring it up in some of the comments and some of the other videos and kind of detailed it a little bit. But I figured I kind of would go more into depth about what I mentioned, along with some other odds and ends. And I also want to go over the story of Bob Humper. I never really talked about the whole Bob Humper character, and I think it would be quite interesting to kind of get into detail about the character, because it's not much, but it was a huge impact in terms of the wrestling history, in terms of comedic entertainment and all that. So I'm going to kind of go briefly into the detail as to why the Bob Humper character happened. So let's get started. Obviously, I still miss wrestling, and I felt there were a few things that I forgot to talk about in the series that I want to bring up. So honestly, I'm going to go over the Bob Humper stuff right now. I had that as the last part of the video, but I figured, since it's primarily that and some other odds and ends, I might as well start with the Bob Humper gimmick. So, the Bob Humper gimmick was kind of not planned. So, the idea of Bob Humper originally back in CWA was just to be a color commentator with like J-Web and stuff. And you could hear me briefly, talking in a different accent sometimes. Sometimes it would just be my voice, which is pretty ironic because, back in the early days of Bob Humper, it was just my normal voice. And then all of a sudden, as we evolved over the years, it would have this weird voice that I would have. Like I would, be like, "Hey guys, it's Bob Humper," stuff like that. I would just continue changing the voice to kind of make it more comedic or whatnot. So I do that, and it's kind of forgotten. And I figured, let's put him in the Rumble, for like 1 second. At the time, I never wore a mask. Now, I want to go over why I wore a mask as Bob Humper and the reason why I did it. So, for Bob Humper, obviously, I wrestled a Scorpion, so literally I would come out with a mask, take it off for the match. I kind of wanted my face to be separate from the character, where, because it would just be, Scorpion wrestling if, he didn't wear a mask. Um, so I wanted to kind of keep the whole Scorpion gimmick with my actual face separate from, the Bob Humper persona, where I would wear a mask to kind of cover that up. That way people will never confuse us like, oh, it's Scorpion, just in normal attire. Like I didn't want that. I wanted to kind of keep that away or whatnot. Um, so that's kind of why the mask happened. And the idea of Bob Humper wrestling was also not planned. So we did a tournament back in Fallout, and we needed participants, and I don't remember what it was, but I think there might have been a no-show. And I pitched the idea of me as a commentator wrestling the match. And for some reason, I came out with the whole mask or whatnot, or the cover up because how cold it was. So, the intention was for me to be excited because it's my first match as this character, and I would be jumping up and down, running in the rain in excitement. And what happened was Ed on camera was booing. I don't know why he was booing. I don't know if he liked the character or whatnot. So I figured, we're going to turn it up a notch. So we did this whole training thing with George or whatnot, and I kept following and all that. And, being stupid. And I wanted to, kind of show that, this character has no experience wrestling. And as we progressed, you know, other stuff would happen, you know, the match with Chris, you know, back at the start of PGW, and, you know, some other odds and ends with Shane, and, you know, the 24/7 role where, you know, that storyline led to Bob Humper winning his first hardcore title. Um, and then at the end, you know, you just have sporadic appearances with, you know, me showing up on camera, and then ultimately, you know, my career ends with, you know, Beer's F5 of me. And the only reason why Bob Humper's career ended so abruptly, which it kind of was, it was just, you know, a random match with the F5, and you would never see me on camera again as the character. The reason why it happened was I thought it was a good trade-off. So, you know, at Endgame, you know, Beer's ended my career up to that point, and I figured, you know, give him, you know, Bob Humper, you know, his career to end. So, like, why not? That was why that happened. Um, but yeah, it turned out, you know, for Bob Humper, you know, I had some good, you know, hilarious matches, you know, like the Stairway to Heaven Death match or the King of Hardcore matches. Literally, it was just a way for me to keep losing matches and be a jobber. And also for me to have more fun in the ring, you know, as, you know, Scorpion and all that. I always took the whole idea of backyard wrestling very seriously. And I figured with Bob Humper, it would be able to add a more comedic side to me and have more fun. And actually, like I mentioned in the previous series, that's one of the reasons why Steven inserted me into the hardcore title picture more often on the road to Endgame, because of, you know, to have more fun, and then, you know, to kind of take a step back. And, you know, the violence was turning back up or whatnot, so we had to stop me down the card. And also, at the time, I wasn't really happy with Emma, as I mentioned. So that's where we were at with that. But I think Bob Humper paved the way in terms of legacy for other characters. So like El Trace Luchador and Trash Boat, um, what is it? El Cinco de Mayo, I think, whatever his name is. I can't remember on top of my head, but like pretty much any other masked character, Bob Humper was kind of a pioneer in that. Um, Even Bob Humper was, you know, around before Leatherface, and, you know, Bob Humper also, I hate to say it, paved the way for Zero Assault to ascend. So it was like a nice little, you know, I was a nice beat up doll for Shane. So he can, you know, turn it up into the mid card scene, and then he would eventually become world champion. So, like, Bob Humper, in a way, helped Zero Assault get to where he was, you know, to become, you know, world champion. Um, which is crazy to say, because that honestly might be Bob Humper's best rival in terms of, you know, people that he's wrestled and all that. Um, so I'm very proud of the character. There are some things though with the character I wish I didn't do. I know there were some stuff that I said on camera that I hate that I will not say, because there would be times where I would kind of go a little too far, you know, with cussing or slurs. It just, you know, that's something I wish I never did. Um, but you know, it's up on YouTube. Wish I could take it back. But it is what it is. But honestly, I don't regret a thing. But what's funny about this character also is I was able to bump more. Because I think I have more adrenaline as Bob Humper, where I would be so excited and stupid, where, you know, basically the funny joke is basically Bob Humper bumped more than Scorpion ever did, which is kind of true. So again, the whole Bob Humper thing only happened because of the whole idea that we needed more participants, and then eventually it led more to being a jobber, and then led to this whole stupid comedic character, and then that's where we got with Bob Humper. So I'm very proud of the Bob Humper character. So that's kind of basically the whole story of the whole Bob Humper gimmick. And um, yeah, a Hall of Famer indeed. So now I do want to go over some stuff that I did not mention in the series. So I know 40's been beat to death and still is. There was another issue that happened that I don't think was discussed in Steven's series, and then I didn't bring it up on this end, or on my end. Um, my graduation party was that day, and that drew a lot of criticism. Um, so basically what happened was, I told Steven about this party or whatnot, and he was mad. Basically, the way with my party was, it was a joint party, and there was no way for me to get around this. And unfortunately, the idea was for my cousin at the time, not Steven, it was another cousin of mine that we also graduated the same year as us. The idea was to do a joint party, and we had to coincide and actually have both of them on the same day together. And basically, I didn't have a say in this, unfortunately. Otherwise, I would have definitely, worked around this. But because I had to share a grad party with my cousin or whatnot, we had to have it on the same day and all that. So I didn't get the choice in terms of the day, the time, the place. That was up to my family at the time, and they chose June 3rd. And that, I told Steven about it, and I still wanted to wrestle, but man, that rubbed them the wrong way. Because the way that the show was structured was, the matches were out of order to, accommodate my party to get out on time. And that's why, some of the issues with some of these matches during the show were, by then, the Royal Rumble and some other odds and ends, people just didn't care at this point because how bad the show was. And I know Steven didn't like the idea of me, telling him all this stuff or whatnot, and then it ended up happening. And then I know he didn't like the fact that I kind of forced him to, be at the party or whatnot. Because it's like, yeah, I'll be at yours, but are you going to be at mine? I basically said it as, it's be nice for you to be there. Because I always put that stuff before wrestling. And I remember I was very irritated that Chris showed up to the party because he wasn't invited at the time. So, like, there's just a lot of things that didn't happen with that, unfortunately. I get why people were mad about that, but I didn't have a choice, unfortunately. And the other thing I think I mentioned was the self-eliminations. And then a few months after that, we had a Proven Controversy episode, which I kind of wanted to make it into a little series. Looking back at it, it was just nothing but us bitching and making excuses, which wasn't the intention. It just turned out to be that way. It didn't work because of me, starting, school and all that stuff post, high school or whatnot. We didn't follow up through on it, which thank goodness it didn't, because this whole concept did not work. There's not much for me to talk about it, but, it was honestly kind of a burial in some aspects. It was fun, but the idea and the timing and the overall presentation, it did not work. I kind of want to take that back. Scorpion versus Chris Reckless. So, one of the things in Steven's video about the whole match of 47 is, despite some of my botches, there was a thing that I mentioned at the end of the video, or at the end of the match, and I told Chris, and I told him that I didn't have to do this. And, like, I basically told him, like, this was just me giving back to him, and I didn't have to give you this win and do this. And he kind of laughed it off at the end. Which I was very honest, and I just wanted to tell him the truth, because I really felt that I did not have to come back and put you over, even though he did not need it at the time. I felt like it was the right thing to do after 2 years since that one match, and I just wanted to tell him how I felt. Chris thought it was a joke, and while that did offend me, his reasonings were completely justified, in which I can't honestly argue. Because again, what I did was wrong. I should have put Chris over in the match at 40, but, at the time, with the whole video deletions and me wanting that push to match with George, fortunately, that all just did not, turn out the way I wanted it to be. And I just felt, that I owed that to Chris. And he may not have cared, and he thought it might have been funny, but for me personally, I thought it was the right thing to do. Even if I worded it wrong to him, I just thought it was what I thought was right. And again, this was my thinking at the time. I'm not saying that's how I feel now, but that's just kind of why I said what I said way back then. And then the one thing I also want to talk about, it's kind of a two-parter because it did have some ramifications. And honestly, it might have some sort of butterfly effect, um, is the interview. So after Final Judgment, when we had that tag team match, one of the things that we did to kind of hype up the whole idea of me wrestling Anthony was this whole interview and this Journeys video. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but Steven and I did not see eye to eye. And between the whole comments, of, my dad and all that, and then the whole egotistical stuff on my end from 40, that was still there. There was just a lot of things that we did not agree with. For example, like the whole Royal Rumble, I went over stuff that I thought was considered egotistical, like Ed, the number one, and all that stuff. And he thought that was stupid, and that, now he looks at it as the whole idea was stupid, like how Ed shouldn't have been number one. He shouldn't have taken most eliminations, and, everything that happened. Like, the Enlightenment never should have happened, like, we just did not agree back then. And I was still bitter, and I get why he was mad. I was still mad. This was just bad timing. Again, this was the worst, this is the worst period of my life. And I was still very bitter. I was still bitter about 40. And there were some things, and I do apologize for that. But again, I was mad. And I was still mad about, the year before. I was still mad at everybody else from how they handled the situation that I went through with my dad and all that. And that all just boiled over, and then it wasn't the intention. It just ended up happening. But I don't remember much from it other than me kind of shitting on some of the wrestlers and like how we have to move on, and some other aspects that Steven mentioned in his one video, because I did go back and rewatch them to kind of get an idea of what I said. And there's just a lot that happened. And the reason why I say it was bad timing was just because, this wasn't a good period in my life. And one of the things was Steven and I just didn't see eye to eye for like 2 years or something like that. And honestly, I don't regret it. I don't regret what I said. And I know that's going to, irritate Steven when I say this, but I have a reasoning for it. And it's just because I just felt it was the start of my regrowth. And I definitely needed to regrow. And over time, I would eventually grow. I think regardless whether it was when this happened or it feels like, let's say, I take off till Missionary 50 and return there, I think if I would return like a Missionary 50 for the first time since, Missionary 40, I think I would have been in that same boat then than I was here. And I figured, it took me, what's the best way to say this? It basically gave me more time to do it now than it would have been to do it later on. Because people would have still remembered that regardless. And I think, being able to, come back, despite those circumstances of what I said, I think helped me in the long run to kind of realize that, we're all human. We all made these mistakes back then. We were all still mad. And it was still this whole effect from 40 and all that. And it's just, you look at that video and then you look at, part 2 of my journeys from after COVID, and you could tell the difference in tone. I was bitter in the first one. And the second one, I kind of seemed a little more humbled and all that. Even in the comments, people were like that I grew up and all that. And it just took a lot of time, like how, people ask if I atoned for my own sins back after Missionary 47. I don't think I really did. Looking back at it before, I thought I did, but now I don't, because it was just self-fulfillment or whatnot. I felt I atoned at Missionary 50, but I felt that my ego was in check after the Buried Alive match. And I think that's where, everything just, died off or whatnot. So it took me a long time to come back from this. And even if I did it later, like, who knows, maybe I would be hated more. But I really felt that, this is what I had to go through to kind of earn my keep back. Um, so I owe a lot to a lot of guys for being patient with me as I went through this journey. Again, I'm still kind of, you know, upset about how things happen, but like they were my family in wrestling, and they were very patient with me, even if they don't like me now. Still, you know, I just very much appreciate Steven giving me that chance to kind of redevelop myself and kind of find myself for who I truly am. Because again, between those 2 years, that wasn't me. Um, I was pretty much a lost soul, and honestly, if it wasn't for Steven, giving me that platform, I honestly don't know if I would have ever been able to come back, let alone have the run that I did between the next 5, 6, 7 years. So I do have to thank Steven for that. And I think this was a huge effect on me because another issue I had around this time was some heat with Anthony Rolin. So we talk about the whole idea of resurrection and me coming back so I could wrestle Anthony. Um, he was arguably buried on the road to resurrection too. I might have mentioned it in the previous series or in this past series, but he was arguably buried, and it wasn't all my fault. Steven at the time wanted to kind of push him back a little bit in terms of the main event scene because how much he was winning. People were getting upset of having to, put Anthony over constantly. Some backlash with the fans. Um, People were just tired. Um, and I wanted to come back as a face, but it wasn't going to work because people still despise me. And it just didn't work. But over time, as we went through with this whole feud, Anthony started to get very irritated with how one-sided it was. Um, and I honestly feel like, and this kind of relates to our personal issues over time or whatnot, is I feel like all of our issues started here. I've always been very quiet about my heat with Anthony, just because I respect him as a person. Now with, learning a lot of things over the summer about Anthony from Steven, I learned of some things that I never knew about Anthony, which out of respect for Anthony, I'm not going to mention it on camera, but there were some things between, how I handle things with, the autism and along with his, issues that he goes through and all that stuff. And over time, how this whole idea of resurrection too and all that happening, I think Anthony blamed me a lot for why this didn't work or the main event push. And I think the stigma between that never went away between him and I, where, how he wanted to wrestle me. And after all this happened, he kind of had this bad idea of, oh, so Scorpion really is an egotistical bitch. And over time, this whole idea of this would get more personal, and the stigma would continue with, personal shots and all that stuff, where he would take personal jabs at me or make fun of my autism, and then I would say things about his, exes and all that stuff, where it finally all boiled down to, me breaking up with my ex, and then he says some things about that, and then it turns into, him bragging about his relationship and then to break up and then so on and so on. There was just a lot of animosity and all that stuff, and even times where Steven had to step in because things were going too far. It's just overall, it's kind of one of those situations where I do think Anthony is a good guy. I don't hate the guy. It's just that we just did not click. Whether it was post resurrection, this whole feud, and then after that personally. Now, we did work very well on camera, and I think Anthony's one of my greatest rivals. It's just that I think the way our characters are personally and how we handle things, it just didn't work between the personal issues, the jealousy, and stuff that happened behind the scenes with the wrestling. I don't think we meshed like how some other people will. I see it one of those things where it's similar to the whole RJ and Steven, saga with their issues and all that. the personal tension, it just wasn't healthy for me, but I still wish him very well. We just didn't click, much like RJ and Steven. Um, but I have, I wish him nothing more than the best. It's just, Anthony and I just did not click. Um, and then there were times, I would always invite him to stuff, and then he just never showed up or just refused or couldn't come down. Um, Anthony and I just did not click very well. I wish we did, but just, it just didn't work. But I wish him nothing more than the best. And I do want to say, though, he is one of my greatest opponents of all time. He basically, helped me kind of start to build my confidence back with these matches. Or I Quit matches absolutely, it's absolutely legendary. Um, so I do got to thank Anthony for that, because again, I still think he's a good guy. We just didn't click, and he is one of the greatest of all time. So there's that. And then I do want to kind of reiterate Medusa's departure a little bit, because I do want to I want to give more respect to that than I did previously, because I was still mad about that whole situation. And I kind of want to be, very kind of it instead of bashing her and stuff. Because I kind of did that in the last one, and I didn't think that was right, because was still mad, and I still am. But I kind of want to be a little more respectful about the whole situation. So what happened with Medusa was, so essentially she basically kept going back to her ex, and we all didn't like it. And this was like the third or fourth time she did that. And then at this point, she broke up with him after Endgame and chose us. Second time, she chose him. There was, an incident where she called Steven, overnight, saying that, he's a narcissist and everything like that. And then I guess apparently the boyfriend was drunk or whatnot. And I guess they had a huge argument or whatnot. And it boiled over. And then I caught on with some lies with Emma and all that stuff, which led me to kind of just abruptly, drop her and all that. And then unfortunately, she basically started going around saying that I needed to get medicated and all that stuff. And that really hurt. That's kind of basically what happened. She just felt like we were using her just for wrestling and didn't care much for her. But it was basically her decision to go back with her, ex or whatnot at the time, where basically she wanted to prioritize him over to wrestling and all that stuff. Which what can you say? She did it to herself, unfortunately. Though she was a huge aspect in my career, that, I can't take back. I wish I could, but she did a lot of good for some of my career, and I always have to give her the respect for that. But, the way that she handled this whole situation, and then how she basically, turned her back on all of us, it's just very unfortunate. And, a lot of wrestlers, don't have that type of respect for her now as they did before. And that's just, the way things happened. She did try to reconcile with Steven sometime, after, the breakup and all that, because she did get engaged at one point, but he basically just said he's not interested. Because I think there might have been some talks of trying to bring her back, or she was trying to crawl back to PGW, and basically Steven shook hand at it and said absolutely not. So actually, now that I think about it, at the time, I don't think, because that would have been way past 53. So she wouldn't have been able to come back regardless. But like, she tried to come back in, our lives and all that. Just, we basically canned that. But that's basically kind of what happened. And some fun stuff I do want to talk about. So, I kind of want to, kind of get away from the bashing and kind of, the controversies. I want to talk about some fun stuff. And the Leatherface trailer and the one interview we did sometime after 52, those were nothing more than school projects, and they actually were very crucial to some, storylines and all that stuff. Like the interview, you get the whole idea of why this whole idea of wrestling happened and all that. And the whole idea was to kind of present Steven, like, Beers as just Steven. And this was a kayfabe thing where it was done to present to my school, and it went over so well. The Leatherface trailer, not as much, but everybody was very intrigued about this first one. They kept asking me questions about it, and I was answering it to them, because they were very fascinated. So I think these were two fun projects that I'm so glad I was able to work on. And the other thing I do want to talk about before I end this video is my feud that almost happened with Genesis. So I talked about, on the road to Missionary 40, how I wanted to win one more title, and I pitched the Warriors, but ultimately it ended up being the Intercontinental title. The original plan was for me to win the Warriors title and lose it to Genesis Bailey at Missionary 40. The reason why was because the idea before Chris was to make Bailey the face of PGW. And that basically, it didn't end up happening, but like, we had this idea that Genesis is a star, he's got the potential, and the only thing that was stopping him was his care for wrestling and all that. And then Chris at the time was doing very good, and ultimately it led to a whole shift where Chris became the true face and not Bailey. And with the amount of times he showed up and all that, myself included, we were all jealous of Chris because he was showing up often, he was doing a lot on camera, and, no one, I don't think, truly ever got that push like Chris did at the time. And that rubbed a lot of guys, including myself, the wrong way. It was very clear on camera, too, at points where we did not like the idea of Chris's push, but that just ended up happening. So it all went, that was the whole idea, and then ultimately that all fell apart with Bailey, and basically George and Brandon were going to come back. Brandon only wanted to wrestle Steven. George only wanted to wrestle either me or Ed, and it turned out to be me that, we went with, because I also wanted to wrestle George, because of, everything I mentioned in the series. So that's basically all I wanted to discuss. Now, the final thing I do want to talk about is the legacy of CWA before I end this bonus video. So, if it wasn't for CWA, PGW wouldn't have existed. CWA was basically our start to kind of learn and understand wrestling and kind of how we operated things. We were immature back in CWA, and I think the way we acted and the way we presented ourselves kind of helped us find our identities in PGW, and it kind of gave us this relaunch for PGW, where PGW would have a legacy of its own that would last almost a decade. So CWA, I kind of crap a little bit about that just because of how a lot of my career wasn't as great before, the whole last run in CWA and all that, but like, I'm very nostalgic now of CWA, and I don't give CWA enough credit. It was honestly probably the most fun, despite the politics from myself and a lot of other people, and I don't appreciate it enough. So I wish the videos were still around. Fuck you, Billy. But basically we came into our own, and I think that really helped us pave the way to what we love, which is professional wrestling. And I think that's our biggest legacy, is how much we care about backyard wrestling. Like, some of us, like I mentioned, we may not like each other, but the one thing that would bring all of us together is pro wrestling. Wrestling has more than one royal family, and that family is PGW, CWA. So this was my little bonus video. A lot of it, controversial stuff on my career, the story of Bob Humper and all that. And again, I do miss doing this. So this was the little bonus video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I'm sure I'll probably get, criticism or some feedback from Steven if he ever sees this. But like, yeah, that's just how I feel about a lot of things. And again, I wish we can go back and do this, but again, we're just getting too old. Some of us are having, health issues. We all have jobs too, and, we all, we said it 10 years ago, and now we're here. We basically had to grow up and kind of start living our lives and all that so we can make a living. So I appreciate all you guys. Marcus, if you ever see this, you wouldn't be able to wrestle me. I would out wrestle the fuck out of you. Probably not now, just because of my back. Probably would give up in like 3 seconds, but you get the point. I still love all you guys. So thank you guys for watching, and again, I will see you guys hopefully in another video, even though I've mentioned that many times, but yeah, so thank you guys for watching the Story of Atonement bonus episode.